of the Psalms. Blessed are they who put their strength in you, who choose to share the joy and sorrows of the world. They do not give way to fear or doubt. They are quickened by divine light and power. They dwell within the peace of the Most High. They go from strength to strength and live with integrity. Now, this is a passage that I go back to again and again. But we need to understand joy and sorrow ourselves deeply before we can attend, support, and pray with others in their joys and sorrows. To walk this talk requires us to endure and learn from life's most painful lessons. The grace and freedom expressed in the psalm and in the video are hindsight lessons, at least for most of us they are. And at the time, our lives might feel a little bit more like this. These are the words of David Foster Wallace. Everything I've let go of has claw marks on it. I love this quote by Guillaume Apollinaire. Come to the edge, he said. But they answered, we are afraid. Come to the edge, he said. So they came, he pushed them, and they flew. Now, some of you might have read my introduction to this sermon in the weekly news that Kathy sends out. But I'm going to talk about St. Columba of both Ireland and Iona. He is claimed by the Irish and the Scots as one of our precious saints. So you're probably going to learn as much about me as you will about Columba. You know, history is told through the eyes of people that have their own understanding. So Columba was born about 1,500 years ago in Ireland in the early days of the Celtic monks. Christianity had just arrived. Ireland and Scotland were outside of the control of the Roman Empire. They were wild places that were thought of as the edge of the civilized world. Now, Columba was born into nobility. Basically, he was a prince. And for whatever reason, he ended up training as a monk and a bard. So this was a crossover between the Druid and the more traditional monastic ways of training. So he trained in poetry, in music, as well as in the new emerging Christianity. One of the things that was new back then were books. And the books were very valuable possessions, and there wasn't very many of them, and very few people could read and write. It was a oral tradition that had a very fine oral lineage of holding everything together. The bards were the history keepers as well as the entertainers and storytellers. So I imagine Columba as being a storyteller and falling in love with these powerful books. And when he was in one of the monasteries, he decided to make a copy of one of the books. The legend says it was the Book of Psalms. And it must have taken quite a while to make this copy. And while it was underway, the abbot found out that Columba, that upstart, was copying his book. And he was outraged and asked for the book back. And Columba said, nope, not having it back. So it was taken to the king's court. And this is the very first case of plagiarism ever recorded in written history. The king's court decided, just as each cow owns its calf, each book should own its copy. Very different understanding than we have today. Just as each cow owns its calf, each book should own its coffee. So Columba was told he had to give the book back, and he still refused. And a battle ensued, and 2,000 of his kinsmen died in that battle, and Columba ultimately lost and ended up being banished from Ireland and taking a small group, 12 of his followers, and leaving in the year 563. And they landed on Iona eventually and started a new life there. So Columba, there's different stories about it. Some people say that he felt so much remorse and grief around the thousands of new Christian followers who died in this battle. But I think it was more likely that he had all those feelings, but he was actually banished for his failing and sent off to start afresh somewhere else. It was very painful for him to leave. I'm going to talk about that a bit more. So where I think Columba got to was that place that both the 12 steps and A Course in Miracles teaches us about, which is when we hit rock bottom and we surrender in the thought there must be a better way. You surrender to higher power and fully admit that you can't steer your life. My computer was listening to me there and Siri came on. That was very strange. Anyway, I'm back on the sermon. You're standing, a few weeks ago I talked about this as standing naked before your God, emotionally just open, a turning inward and search for survival and strength, and a turning away from the external world. It's also a time that you can begin to get your ego in check and to meet God within instead of without. You're not without God. God is within. There's a great song about this that is from the New Thought tradition. I've been sharing quite a few songs from New Thought. This one is by Daniel Nemod. When my hands were emptied, when my hope was gone, I couldn't help but wonder, what had I done wrong? Even though my heart was broken, there was no need to despair, 'cause the vessel must be open to put something better there. Into my empty hands, gently you poured new life for me. Yours is a perfect plan. The ups and the downs were meant to be. Now I understand you needed my empty hands. Now, however you see that theology of whether we make good whatever circumstance or whether the bad things happen for a reason, doesn't really matter. The song is pointing to the fact that when our hands become open, when we've been forced to let go, then we can pick up new insights, new beauty. And we have to, because sometimes the loss, as it was for Columba, is so colossal that there's almost nothing left. And the peace that passes all understandings that we talk about so flippantly, not flippantly, just so casually, I think is the word, in Christianity, is profoundly beautiful. And if you meet that in a place where you desperately need it, it changes you forever. So the process of navigating the loss of our lives as we knew them to be is always tender and often highly unpleasant. But when we surrender to circumstance and admit that we can't find our way through on our own, we can also experience an incredible freedom. I think of it as a surrender and ceasing to argue with reality. But why, God? But why? When I eventually let go of the story of who I thought I was and how my life should be and how other people should behave and treat me, I found an entirely new way of being and a new life that actually suited me a lot more because it was based in who I was becoming and not who I had been 20 years before. When our hands are already occupied, we can't receive. And I love that Jewish metaphor of us as vessels that continually receive Spirit. It flows through us. If we are already full of the idea of who we are, there's no room for the concept of who we are to grow. So there's two specific teachings I want to go into now that St. Columba learned the hard way. And one, the fruit of that is a true sense of belonging to God's good earth. And I think this is a lesson that he got from being an exile, from not belonging. And when we end up in a place where we actually hear God acknowledging that we are not a mistake, that we belong here, that we are not the summation of the things that we have done, that just in our birthright we belong here, then we can stop striving, consuming, proving ourselves, arguing with other people, all those duality things that don't really lead us very far. So one of the things that Columba really embodied was a true sense of belonging. He belonged on Iona. He belonged on this new life. He embraced the new wholeheartedly, didn't just live in the past. And the other one was, I think he loved so, so deeply because he grieved so deeply. There's a story about the very last night he was in Ireland. He went to this stone. It's called the Flagstone of Loneliness. I haven't been there yet, but it's a stone in which supposedly if you slept on it, it would absorb the sorrow in your heart and you would wake up lighter. I love that idea. And I think especially mossy rocks seem to do that for me. In all her guises, grief reframes our whole experience to see through the lens of love. A heart cries so profoundly and sincerely that we literally see through the eyes of the heart in every encounter. Now, this is a really important part of the ministry I do. And I have a prayer that I think explains this really well. It's called the Prayer for Those Who Weep. In the mystery of a broken heart, we ask for your blessing, God. We surrender the feeling of grief from its tragic story. Sometimes life is not what it ought to be. Sometimes love reveals an ugly face in us. Sometimes we lose the ones we hold most dear. Let go our hands, dear Lord. We offer them up in service to you. Gently tease our fingers from their grasp. We ask this for ourselves, and we ask this for all those who find themselves overwhelmed upon the sea of grief. Grief was a key ingredient in my own choice to become a man of cloth, a human in service to peace and compassion, because what other return can you give for all that love gives you? Now, I'm hinting at this a lot, and I think I talked about this when I talked about Iona before, but when I lived in the Abbey on Iona, I was married. I'm married again. This is my second marriage, but in my first marriage, it was while we were in the Abbey that she realized um, that I wasn't somebody that she could love as a husband. And that was very painful for me. And then it got even more painful because I watched her fall in love with someone else. Um, and I knew it was time and I had to let go and leave. But it all happened so fast. And I remember one night after I'd realized, oh, it's not just that she shouldn't be with me, she needs to be with someone else now. And I remember lying in bed and just, we were all, it was such a mess. We were all the leaders of this community, and there was the staff team that we had and volunteers under them and all the guests. And I loved it there. And this was my home and my community. And I remember praying deeply, so earnestly praying, God, show me what to do. Tell me what to do. And I probably was sleep deprived. I suspect I wasn't getting a lot of sleep. And just in my mind's eye, I received a daydream, a vision. And it was of an old monk. And he was pointing. And he was pointing down to the abbey. And I went in my daydream, I went to him and I said, I can't see what you're pointing at. And all of a sudden, the abbey disappeared. And that was when I realized, oh, he's a Celtic monk, because they worshipped outdoors and they had tiny little huts. They didn't have the big stone abbey. That was the Benedictines. So anyway, this Celtic monk that I believe was St. Columba was pointing down to the beach, Martyrs Bay, where all the boats would come and go. And on the beach, I saw a little woven boat, a coracle. And I knew the stories about the Celtic monks, how they would go out from their secure nest. They would get in the boat and go out and go wherever the tide carried them. And in that moment, I decided to leave Iona, to go where I don't know. And very shortly afterwards, I found myself in the Pacific Northwest. So I had this mystical experience that I then followed up with my life, and my bank account and where I was. Now, the Zen tradition teaches us about mystical experiences. They're called satori. And they say that if you do have a mystical experience in meditation or in distress, in my case, you need to integrate that into your daily life. You're not supposed to hang out in the mystery. We're actually supposed to come back down to earth and integrate the insights. So when I reflected on this encounter, it was clear that my heart, that something in me already knew what to do. It was just the difficulty that was my barrier that was stopping me from embracing and saying yes. And I think I was really inspired by Columba's story that one human can start over entirely again in the face of utter failure and make good even the worst circumstance. And Columba, like all the saints, he imitates Christ as his God. And he's modeling for us a very specific way of following Jesus. So what I was seeing was a man, a devoted servant to the sacred, who chooses to co-create beauty, healing, and a fearlessness in a wild world. Now, one of the things you need to know about Columba was he was going to the island of the Druids, and he only had 12 followers, and they were not armed. And there's all sorts of stories about him going into the center of Scotland and meeting the kings and meeting the Druids and having all sorts of contests. There's all these wonderful legends about him and how he would sing and how his voice sounded like a melodious lion. Not that anybody in Scotland would have known what a lion sounded like. But he went out and he brought this love of God that he had, and he shared it. And he really was one of the key person that brought the Christian message to the Scots from the Irish. So I want to read some of the things that I've written. He's a bright light, revealing both our shadows and a path that was hidden. And one of the things I like most about Columba is there's nothing fluffy about him. Cynthia Bourgeault often says that Christianity is often wrongly boiled down to the following teaching: Jesus is nice, so you need to be nice. This is not at all what Christianity was about. It was not about being nice. And Columba, even in the painting of him and the horse, let me share that for you. I'm not finding it. Sorry about this. All right, I found it. This is my favorite painting about St. Columba. And this is on the last day of his life and the horse coming up. And he knows that he's going to die. And even in that tender encounter, you can see in his eyes a fearlessness, an ability to stare at truth and to let people be their full selves, to let God be its full self. That painting was by John Duncan. Um, Columba's God is breathtakingly beautiful and graceful, and he carries in his heart a fearlessness that allows him to love and share light with all of creation, not just where it's safe. St. Columba calls me to do much more than let go and surrender. He inspires me to embrace and welcome the new as it unfolds and to be fearless in that I'm actually quite a fearful person. Most of us are. Had Columba never failed, never been forced on his journey from safe harbor to unknown island of the Druids, he would not have become the saint or the man of peace. Columba became a man able to share the joys and sorrows of others. So let me go back to Psalm 84. Blessed are they who put their strength in you, who choose to share the joy and sorrows of the world. They do not give way to fear or doubt. They are quickened by divine light and power. They dwell within the peace of the Most High. They go from strength to strength and live with integrity. Amen. So may we, like St. Columba, be so inspired to know God, to share the intimacy of that connection and carry that presence to every creature. This is a prayer attributed to St. Columba. Kindle in our hearts, O God, the flame of love that never ceases, that it may burn in us, giving light to others. May we shine forever in your temple, set on fire with your eternal light, with your Son, Jesus Christ. Amen. May the blessing of God rest upon you, and Christ's peace abide with you, and the Spirit illuminate your heart, now and forevermore. Thank you, everybody.